You're a professional. You know how to. I don't need to. Probably don't have any questions for me as far as it relates to Beyond UX specifically.
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm not as much a professional on the other side of the mic. More often, I'm the one asking the questions.
All right, are you ready?
Ready.
Let's do it. What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, welcome to the show. I am super stoked to have you. Have you picked up your paperback copy of Beyond UX Design, Master Your Craft, Beyond Pixels and Prototypes yet? Unlock the secrets of UX success and learn all the things they didn't teach you in school. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the code LISTENER to get 10% off your entire order. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/book to learn more. Are you feeling stuck in a low design maturity environment? Are you unsure how to demonstrate the true value of your work? Femke's Product Strategy for Designers course is here to help. And in just 6 weeks, Femke's course will help you enhance your strategic influence and tackle product challenges with confidence. Join over 400 designers who have already transformed their careers with expert videos, live calls, and interactive projects. Cohort 6 starts on March 3rd, 2025, and seats are limited. Don't wait. Visit beyonduxdesign.com/strategy to enroll today. And if you haven't done it already, please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are a regular here and you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That'll help me out so much more than you can imagine. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Raju, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, and Adina for all their support. And if you want to join these fine folks and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free, you'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. You can get instant access to the video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. That's a steal. And for more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then I would love it if you told your mom and them. So when you're starting out in your career, something people often ask themselves is, do I want to be an entrepreneur? Do I want to work for somebody else? Do I want to go off on my own? Or do I want to the 9-to-5 grind and all that stuff? But what if you could take that entrepreneurial spirit, that go-get-'em spirit, and apply that to your career or to school, to education, to life in general? You don't have to be an entrepreneur to think like an entrepreneur, and it might actually help you quite a bit. So I am excited to have the one and only Eli Woolery on the show today. Eli is an author, speaker, and designer with a background in product, user interface, and user experience design. He co-hosts the Webby-nominated Design Better podcast with Aaron Walter, one of my favorite shows. If you're not listening to it, stop what you're doing right now and go subscribe, and then come back and you can listen. Featuring guests like John Cleese, Debbie Millman, and Seth Godin. John Cleese, that's a fun episode, by the way. Like, I have one of my favorites. I love that. He's amazing. A lecturer in Stanford's product design program, Eli has co-taught the senior capstone course since 2013. Formerly the director of design education at InVision, he authored the Design Thinking Handbook used in curricula at institutions like UC Berkeley and USC. A lifelong ocean enthusiast, Eli also co-founded the underwater photography magazine Wet Pixel Quarterly and leads design projects through his consultancy Out of the Deep Blue. Eli, I am so excited to have you on Beyond UX Design. How's it going, man? Great to have you here.
Hey, Jeremy. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and talk about design and entrepreneurship and anything your audience is curious about.
Yeah, awesome, man. So you host the Design Better podcast, obviously one of the best. If you Google top UX podcasts, it's consistently on the top 10 list. So I'm so excited, a little bit humbled and somewhat nervous, I'll be honest, to have you on the other end talking to you today. So, maybe afterwards I'll have you for some tips and some feedback on how it went and how
Sure.
I can, make it better. Always looking for some feedback there. So we had a chance to chat a couple of weeks ago and you brought up this idea of the mindset and how you can apply this beyond just that. And as we were talking, I'm going to ask you in a minute to talk about yourself, but it was awesome, your backstory, all the things you started and done. And so I'm just kind of curious, thinking about that idea, entrepreneurial mindset, tell us a little bit about you and how you've kind of gotten to this point where you realize, like, even if I'm working for other people, I can always be thinking like an entrepreneur. Just tell us about you, man. How'd you get into this game and all that stuff? You got such a fascinating backstory. I think people, if they don't know you yet, they're going to love this.
Oh, thanks, Jeremy. Well, I will say that I didn't really start off with that mindset. I mean, coming out of school, so I did the product design program at Stanford, where I now teach as an undergrad in the kind of mid to late 90s. And it would have been a great time to have had that mindset because this is the first .com era. a lot of my classmates went off to start big things, and companies like Google and others came out of that era. So if I had had the foresight, I probably would have invested more in that during my kind of undergraduate career and shortly thereafter. But I was really mostly just interested in like building and making things, which is why I chose product design. So for folks that aren't familiar with that major, it originated in the mechanical engineering department at Stanford. So it was very focused for most of its time on physical product design. And that's kind of where a lot of my training was. But it was just starting to kind of nascently be more converging with digital product design and human computer interaction and things like that. But I started at the beginning of my career, I wanted to build physical products. I wanted to build products ideally for the outdoors because I was really into ocean, backpacking, hiking, and those kinds of things. And so I wanted to go out there and find a job at like the North Face or Patagonia or something like that. The challenging thing was that product design is this sort of, at least as taught at Stanford, you get this foundation in human-centered design and design thinking, and then you get some amount of mechanical engineering training and some amount of sort of more industrial design and studio design, but you're not really deep in any of those things. And so you come out and you have a little portfolio and whatnot, and people don't understand, are you a mechanical engineer? Are you an industrial designer? Like, what are you? We don't know where to put you. And so at the time, and I think it's still to some degree, it's hard to get those, entry level jobs and really kind of feel like you fit into a larger machine or larger organization. So I struggled a bit to find a job, and I decided, well, I'm going to try something different. And I found this internship in Bermuda where I went out for a year and worked at a biological research station. And that's where I learned
That's like every college kid's dream, right?
Yeah, it was like,
internship in Bermuda.
right. It was pretty cool. I learned to dive. I got research dive certified, so I helped out the researchers, and it sort of reinforced my love for the ocean. And I wasn't really using my product design training, so I was like, how could I get a job that sort of merges these two things? So I found another internship that was back in California at a company called Light and Motion that did underwater photography equipment and bike lights. These two sort of seemingly disparate categories, but there's lighting involved in both. And I got in that internship and then eventually got hired full time. And that was sort of like a master's degree in manufacturing and making things because they're a vertically integrated manufacturer. And at the time, they manufactured most of the product in-house. So we would be upstairs in this old building on Cannery Row, the great view of the ocean, like designing stuff. And then we'd go downstairs to the kind of basement floor, and they had computer-controlled mills and lathes and injection molding machines. And we would actually like build the products, like the first round and prototype, and bring a product into manufacturing. So it gave me a real sense and understanding of like how products are made. So that's great. And I really enjoyed it. But after about 4 years, and probably as I tell my story, you'll understand the common theme is like a short attention span or like I think like an employer looking from the outside say this person is not very focused in their career path. But I felt like I learned kind of what I wanted to learn. I was still really into the ocean. I'd gotten into photography, but I was also interested in the research side of things. So I ended up going back to school for a bit, Moss Landing Marine Labs, also here in Monterey Bay area, and pursued marine science. I was using my product design a bit, helping build equipment for researchers to, like, we had built a towed camera system to study sea lions and the salmon fishery, things like that. But I also discovered through the course of that I love the field work and, again, making things, but so much of science is writing grant proposals and then doing the statistical work afterwards, which I just wasn't very good at and didn't enjoy. So I moved on from that. And again, the photography thing, underwater thing, I got back in touch with a friend of mine who had started a website called WebPixel about underwater photography. We started a magazine together called WebPixel Quarterly, ran that for about 3 years. And that was my first like real kind of entrepreneurial venture of any kind, I'd say, other than doing like freelance and solo kind of contract type stuff. And it was amazing. I mean, we got to travel all around the world, do photography, meet interesting people. We did not make much money though. And this was at like the time when print advertising was sort of crashing and everything was coming online as far as ads go. So we struggled a bit there, and there was a little bit of a tension between me and my co-founder, not like animosity. We're still friends and he's a great guy, but we had different goals. He was in a different sort of phase in his life than that. He had gone through the .com era and come out pretty well on the other side of it. I had not. And I just had a kid, so I needed to make money. And for him, sometimes I felt like it was maybe more of a hobby than a business. And so we just had a little bit of a different mindset. And ended up folding the magazine, and I still wanted to work on things like entrepreneurially. So I applied for an accelerator program that was through Eric Schmidt's VC firm, Innovation Endeavors, where you've probably heard of like Y Combinator or these other accelerators. You typically come to that with a team and a product and probably some traction before you get in. This was very different. And it was like, we'll set you up with a team. You apply as an individual. You can work on whatever you want. And, and so I got into that, did that for about a year. And that was, some of these little segments in my career have also doubled as at like school or graduate school for me. And that was sort of like a mini MBA and understanding like how startups work, how venture funding works, the pros and cons of taking that route as far as building a product goes. As the case with many, our startup kind of crashed and burned, and I worked with some other startups for a while. And then this was 2015. I was working for a startup, and it started to crash and burn. And unfortunately, it was the day after my son was born, my second child, that I found out I'd been laid off. It's like, okay.
Oh, God.
The timing wasn't ideal, but it did give me some space, and it took a little time off to think about like, what do I want my career to look like? Where do I want to work? And I knew we had by that time moved back down to the Monterey Bay Area. I knew that I wanted to be down here. I wanted a remote job. I didn't want to have to commute up to Silicon Valley. I was at that point teaching up at Stanford, but that was just once or twice a week, half the year. And so that I had been using InVision, the prototyping tool, in my own work. At the time, they were one of the only semi-sizable tech companies that was all remote. And so I reached out to...
I don't think I realized that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This was 2015, 2016, probably one of the bigger remote tech companies apart from Automatic. Reached out to my now business partner, Aaron Walter, and he was starting this team at InVision called Design Education. I was his first hire. So we kind of started that team together. Started a podcast there, Design Better, which I can talk more about. And launched into kind of a segment of my career that was being entrepreneurial within a company versus outside a company. And happy to talk about that. And then, as with many competitors to Figma, InVision crashed and burned because Figma kind of dominated that tool landscape.
Yeah.
And so we were able to spin out the podcast before InVision died. And we now, for the past about 2 years, been running it independently.
I love it, man. So you mentioned going off like after some time and starting your own magazine. That was your first entrepreneurial exploration, I guess. How far into your career was that? If you certain amount of years, was it, you mentioned hopping around a lot. Was that after a certain amount of time, long time, or did you find it kind of early?
It was, so I had worked full time for about 4 years for the company Light in Motion as a design engineer. When I left there, I was doing some like consulting contract work, and then I was in graduate school. So I was doing random jobs like electrician's assistant and as a waiter, things like that. So then, and then the magazine was around 2006. So it's about 7 years into my career that I first did that. Yeah.
So when you found that, I'm curious, like if you could maybe talk about that experience and maybe pre-entrepreneur versus post-entrepreneur. I'm curious the sort of traits that you discovered doing that and how maybe your original first 7 years of your career, you felt maybe could have used this sort of concept, this entrepreneurial confidence, if you want to call it that. I'm curious, what changed? What happened after post? What did you start to see and the things that you started to do that maybe changed how you approached your career once you've sort of uncovered that insight?
It's a good question. And I don't know that it happened sort of immediately, and it wasn't like a light bulb insight at any one moment, but it was more that I wanted to make things. I wanted to make this magazine. And I realized at the time I was doing a lot of photography. I was like, oh, maybe I could become a photographer. And I did that for a short period. But I realized like, if you really want to have an impact and kind of change the world, oftentimes you got to start your own thing. That if it doesn't exist, you got to make it. And for me at this point, there were magazines like National Geographic, and there were some magazines that were more focused on underwater photography. But there wasn't something in my mind at the level that I saw where it is like National Geographic level quality photography, really good print design, and a paper magazine. And so those things just sort of spurred me to get in touch with my then business partner and start this thing. But I would say some amount of entrepreneurs, there's maybe you could roughly categorize it in two ways. One group sees a financial opportunity and wants to take advantage of that. One group wants to make something and has that mindset. And sometimes those things overlap. I would say I fell more into the category of I really want to make something and hopefully I can make some money doing it versus I see a really big like business opportunity here. And, not surprisingly, the underwater photography world is pretty small, not a huge market. I mean, you can serve people that certainly make money there, but not the area you might go if you want to become, a multimillionaire or billionaire.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because thinking about those two models, if you think about someone who doesn't necessarily want to work for themselves, right? That financial opportunity piece is probably not what they're looking for working for a company. It's probably more the stability. I don't have to do the sales. Someone just sort of gives me a salary and I get paid every other week or whatever. But that mindset of making something, it's interesting because I think there's a lot of people who get jobs, and maybe this is some people later in their life, they just sort of like, whatever, do what you tell me to do, I get paid and I go home. But especially people early in their career, that idea of making something, getting a paycheck, working for someone else, having them finance your ability to make something, that's a really interesting way to play around with your career where you're working. You can go and explore things and find bubble assignments and things like that. So I want to talk more about this as it relates to somebody who has a job, or maybe even in school. We could maybe break this up into two different parts of the conversation. But I love this idea of taking that entrepreneurial mindset and applying it to your career, to your job, and things like that. So first, I want to sort of dig into that concept, though. The personality traits, the traits that you see that make a great entrepreneur that are also applicable to a really great employee, a really great individual contributor, or something like that. What's the overlap there? What do you see, the kind of things that someone could take from that entrepreneur and apply to their own personal career?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some people call it intrapreneurship or, doing entrepreneurship within a company. And I felt like to some degree, my time at InVision, I had that luxury of working on things that I wanted to work on, that Aaron wanted to work on, and that building sort of product, which ended up being mostly the podcast within the company and having the company support. And, it was a successful thing for the company too, and that it brought attention and customers and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think the traits, as far as traits go, so I mentioned the class I teach, I think, and you did it too as an intro, but it's 2-quarter capstone class for undergrad project designers. They come up with a product idea and they try to make it real in the world. And that often just means like, I'm going to open source something, or I'll donate this product to the schools, or maybe I'll start a Kickstarter, but does not often mean that I go off and start a company afterwards. But in a small fraction, they do. And there's been a couple successful companies come out of it. And I would say that, observing those teams, there are some shared traits. One of them is just scrappiness and like being able to find resources and not being afraid to ask questions or favors of people. I mean, our teaching faculty is pretty well connected, and we also bring in industry coaches, and we try to give the kids a lot of resources. And sometimes they'll get stuck, and we'll give them a resource and they just won't follow through. It's like maybe they're shy, or maybe, there could be legitimate reasons why they don't want to. But what I've noticed is the ones that are successful make those connections and, just make things happen. And so, or they're not, we give everybody a budget in the class of like $500. That's great to build your product. But the ones that are successful, well, they find other resources too. Maybe they, again, like start a Kickstarter or something like that. That sort of resourcefulness and scrappiness. And then sort of, parallel or overlapping with that is an amount of grit and stick-to-itiveness and not being phased when things inevitably go wrong. I mean, I think a really good case study of this is probably one of the products that came out of the class 5 or 6 years ago. And it was these 2 young women who were athletes, and they wanted to create a tampon for athletes because they saw this, they saw that there wasn't anything like that in the market. Now, this particular product, it ends up being essentially a medical product, has to have FDA approval. So there's a whole host of things that you have to get right.
And for a student to have to go through that process too, that's going to be crazy. Huh?
It's totally daunting. And, they didn't get through that within the confines of the class. And they actually ended up moving from our class to a more sort of entrepreneurship oriented class. But they got through it. They stuck to it. I think they've raised $4 or $5 million. They have a product on the market.
Wow, okay.
And then they're doing really well. But I don't think if they got stuck early on, I was like, oh gosh, well, this is going to be really hard because we have to get FDA approval. And how are we going to do that? And they realized, we could actually do this in Europe where it doesn't require that same levels of approval. We could start there. And I to be sure, I'm not sure if they actually ended up going that, but I remember talking with them about that. And they're just, just really resourceful, had a lot of grit. And I think those are the two of the big things. Also, I think say, I think if we're talking also about not just entrepreneurship, but design, one of the other things is just general sense of curiosity about the world and how things work and how, not just how like a product works, but how does a business work? Or what's the day in the life of an engineer like, or curiosity about other disciplines, curiosity about just, the world in general. That's another one I'd put in that bucket.
I love that. And as I'm thinking about this, I've worked for a long time in giant enterprise organizations, and something that I've seen time and time again is sort of the enterprise beats you down, and it's like, why am I even bothering bringing these things up? But there's always the opportunity at these enterprise, and enterprise gets a bad rap. I personally think I like personally me working in big companies, working with big teams because the resources are there, right? And what I've found is that you can, if you apply a lot of these same principles, you can network internally, find the right people, find funding for something. You have an idea, you learn how to pitch it. It's not very different, I don't think, from going to, a VC fund and pitching some idea and getting them to finance it, right? And if anything, it might even be a little bit easier because this isn't actually their money. So you don't have to separate someone's money from themselves. It's just like a budget that they have. So, they have to use it. But I found very similar opportunities inside of large organizations to say, I found this major opportunity. It's costing us X amount of dollars. If we can go and do this thing, we think we could save the company a lot of money, or I found an opportunity. There's a market for this. We think we could sell it and make a bunch of money, or whatever it is. But in those large organizations, there's often a framework for that, even if it's unofficial. Even if it's unofficial, it might take a little bit longer. You might have to wait until next funding round or budget fiscal year, whatever. But there's opportunities there. And I think a lot of times these large organizations have a lot of opportunity internally to apply these principles that you're talking about while you still have a salaried job, and the intrapreneurship that you talked about. I think that's a fantastic way to put it. I don't know. I know you worked a lot for yourself, small company. You ever worked in like a larger org like that and had experience there?
Not so. I mean, essentially, InVision was the largest company I worked with. So they got it up to around 1,000 employees at the peak. And there was more sort of like organizational challenges. And I observed that from when I started, it was around 200 employees. And as that scaled up, like those kinds of challenges. But I've not worked anywhere like a Google or a Microsoft or anything like that. I have, consulted with companies like that, and we would often go into the companies and run workshops and things like that. So I've kind of like viewed it from a close distance and talked to many like design leaders that have worked at those types of things. And there's a lot of common challenges, I think, and common opportunities. And one of the big takeaways, both from my own work and from talking to other design leaders, is it's so important like who you're reporting into and who your manager is as far as the types of opportunities that you'll have. I was really lucky when Aaron hired me that he is very much, I don't know if hands off is exactly the right word, but very trusting, and like will set goals and a vision for what he wants you to accomplish, and you can go on and execute that on your own terms, more or less. And I think a lot of folks that are working at big organizations, if they have that kind of leadership, really appreciate it. And if they don't, they suffer.
Yeah, that's a really great point. That is a fantastic point, because being able to do what I just said a minute ago requires a boss who's not micromanaging you the entire time, who is more trusting. Hands off maybe is the wrong term, but more trusting. It allows you to do that thing and play around and find those things and do that stuff within the framework of larger priorities and things like that. That's a really great caveat. I'm curious, when it came to the Design Better podcast started out as the InVision podcast. How did that come about? Did you pitch that to somebody? Was that y'all's idea? Or was that something someone came to you and said, we have a marketing idea. Do you want to host it? How did that work?
Funnily enough, right before I started with InVision, I had been laid off. I had some time on my hands, and I was commuting up to Stanford once or twice a week and listening to a lot of podcasts, and I just got interested in the space. And so I had started my own show. Essentially, it was called Curious by Design. And I had recorded like 3 or 4 episodes. I hadn't launched it yet. And then I started talking to Aaron. And I think part of what was the attraction of my background was that I had been working on a podcast, because that's something he wanted to do at InVision. So we kind of, we got together and we did a few things when we started working on this team. One was we wrote some small books together. You mentioned this design thinking handbook. He wrote one on principles of product design, and we collaborated one on design leadership. And they were, the short, 50, 60 page books, but with a lot of kind of multimedia content, with well-produced like documentary style video interviews and audio interviews. And then we also did the podcast. And I think our initial thinking, at least mine, was like, oh, these books are awesome. They're like really high quality content and production. As podcasts, it can be great too, but it almost felt like more like a supporting character, like in a movie versus like the main character. I was like, oh, these books, that's going to be where all the attention is. And the books did well. And we ended up producing 11 of them.
Yeah, I remember actually we used to pass those around with our team, all the InVision books. I thought they were great.
And we're actually, we're bringing them back. So we finally acquired the rights to them. So we're slowly kind of rolling them out on Design Better. But it was a little bit of a surprise, I think, how much the podcast really became the hero of our team. And when we started, especially when we started, the first year or two was very focused on designers and design leaders and product design. And at a certain point, you talk to enough of those people and it feels like you're repeating yourself a little bit. And we felt like, gosh, if we're getting a little bit bored of this, I think our audience probably is too. And so how can we pull from different disciplines, still talk about creative challenges, collaboration, but what's that like if you're a comedian like John Cleese, or what's that like if you're starting a fashion brand like Eileen Fisher? Let's pull these fascinating people that have had pretty rich and storied careers in other realms, and let's talk to them about, what are things that we can pull from their insights that somebody who is a designer, product designer, working on a product team might pull into their work. So that really leveled up the show, made it much more interesting for us, and I think made it more interesting for the audience too.
Yeah, well, it grows your audience as well, because anybody might want to hear from John Cleese versus, product designers only want to hear from product designers. All right, sorry for the interruption in the middle of the interview, but it is time for a mid-roll sponsor break. Let's hear it from our sponsor this week, Wix Studio. Web designers, let's talk about the C word, creative burnout. Your client site has real portfolio potential, but between resourcing, feedback, tight budgets, and even tighter deadlines, it just doesn't make the cut. Wix Studio helps close that gap. Built for agencies and enterprises, you can bring your vision to life and keep it alive. With no-code animations, tons of AI tools, reusable design assets, and advanced layout tools. For your next project, check out Wix Studio at beyonduxdesign.com/Wix. That's beyonduxdesign.com/Wix. And now, back to the show. Going back to this idea, though, of intrapreneurship, what I love about this, I had an old podcast a long time ago. We do it just semi-regularly. We never officially stopped it. But Retro Time was a software podcast. And we used to do a podcast, and my buddy Derek was the co-host, and we worked together at GE. And we joined a big team, giant team. Like, we got rolled into this big, giant 1,000-engineer software org, gigantic team. All right, the idea that you're ever going to meet 1,000 people and get to know them is very low. And so we noticed almost immediately when we joined this team was silos. Everybody's working in silos, which makes sense. You got 1,000 people. How are you going to share with 1,000 people, right? It's impossible. So what we did, we started to say, like, hey, we know this. We got a podcast. What if we went and interviewed random people from across the org and posted it to, our Slack channel as like a video, and just got way to introduce people and all that stuff. And it started off as a way for us to just sort of get to know other people. But the beautiful thing about this is, like, thinking about that entrepreneur mindset, it really did increase our social capital within the organization, because the leadership started to notice this, right? And they said, oh, wow, you're doing this, you're taking the initiative and things like that. And I think this is a really great example. We never posted this outside of the org. We never went outside of our private Slack channel. But I think it's similar kind of concept to this idea, though, of entrepreneurship. And, it didn't make us any money, but I think it absolutely did increase our standing within the organization and got us noticed by leadership, which then enabled us to do other things and maybe promotions and opportunities and move inside the organization that we probably wouldn't have had we just kind of kept our mouth shut and just put our heads down and did our work. And I think that's like a great example of using that entrepreneurial mindset. And I never really connected that. I always thought of it as networking and things like that. And I never really thought of it until this conversation, how that is really taking that entrepreneurial mindset and applying it in one way. And I've said that story to a bunch of different people. And the thing that I often hear is, introverts, that sort of pushes them away and I can't go and talk to people. I'm curious, that entrepreneurial mindset, people often think about it as being something like I'm networking, I'm talking, you mentioned before, asking for favors and things like that. And I'm curious, have you experienced this with some of your students who might be more introverted? And how do they apply that? Maybe that makes them more comfortable as an introvert instead of going and just shaking hands with everybody, talking to everybody, and that might put them off. So I'm curious, any thoughts there from an introvert's perspective, how to apply this concept without, having to be in front of people constantly?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a few things. So one thing you mentioned the size of your organization, and this isn't directly answering your question, but I'll come back to it. Have you ever heard of Dunbar's number before? Is that a familiar
No,
concept?
what is that?
So this, I think, is a social psychologist came up with this framework that there's this number, 150 people is essentially as many relationships as you can kind of hold in your head and have a close relationship with. So once a team or organization scales past that, it's very hard to kind of hold all those relationships in your head and be effective. So I think doing what you were doing, intentionally going out and making those connections, that's a really powerful thing. And I think beyond even entrepreneurship, it shows a lot of leadership. And I think sometimes people confuse leadership with management. Like, I'm an IC, I'm not a leader, but I'm assuming maybe were you an IC at the time you were doing that project?
I was, yeah. Yep.
So you were demonstrating leadership within an IC role, and that has a lot of benefits. That definitely kind of raises your status within an organization, and people will look up to you. And I think that's one thing that, one way to frame, if you are like me, an introvert, is to just kind of push yourself in directions that make you slightly uncomfortable. And I think that also overlaps with this idea of imposter syndrome, which many of us, even well into our careers, still face. To me, I've tried to think of it as a positive signal if I feel like I'm encountering that, because it means I'm pushing myself in a direction I'm uncomfortable and will hopefully grow from that experience. And for me, that was teaching. I knew that at some point I wanted to try teaching. Like, maybe when I'm close to retirement, that sounds like a interesting career goal. But I didn't know if I'd like it or not. So, something I've done over the course of my career was just try to like prototype things and see, will I like this or will I not? And I really liked it. I really liked interacting with students. I didn't like being in front of class. And in fact, my first few years teaching, I got bad. You get graded by the students essentially. And my marks, I got a lot of positive marks on one-on-one interactions. My lecturing skills, I did not get good marks. And it turned out people were having a hard time hearing me in the room because I'm kind of quiet. And so when I'm mic'd up and people could hear me, that improved a lot. So I think pushing yourself in directions you're uncomfortable, also being aware of where you might have weaknesses and how you can ameliorate those is important. But I hope I actually answer your question, because I know I went in a couple different directions there.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I mean, because I think that's something that, a lot of entrepreneurs sort of get dinged for not talking enough, not being visible, especially in a large organization, in a company, and so those are the people that unfortunately I think get passed over a lot for raises or promotions because they aren't seen, they're not promoting themselves as much. And I think that's something, going out of your comfort zone a little bit, I think this is something it's unfortunate and it probably isn't correct. But I think a lot of times those introverts tend to get overlooked. And I think it's sort of one of those things like, if you're not going to go shake hands physically, can you send emails? Can you send DMs? Can you, how do you ask for favors? How do you get in front of people? How do you negotiate? Do whatever you need to do. Maybe you could do it async. Maybe you could do it over, Slack or email or something. And so anyway, those are the kind of things I sort of think about when I think about an entrepreneur. It's sort of like that hustle, that idea of hustling. It's just always being in front of people, which I feel like I don't know what the statistics are. I'd be curious to see what the level, the number of entrepreneurs who consider themselves extroverts versus introverts, and how does a successful entrepreneur who is an introvert operate, and how do they go about doing that? And I don't know. It's kind of one of those things kind of interesting to think about, because I think a lot of times when people think entrepreneurs, they just think of like the in-your-face salesman that's always constantly selling and things like that. But I clearly you mentioned you were an introvert. I think it's possible to be a successful entrepreneur and take those concepts and apply them being an introvert. So.
Yeah, totally. I'm sort of like smiling a little bit here because this conversation is reminding me of this. Have you ever seen this company hierarchy cartoon?
No, I don't think I have.
If you look up like the Gervais principle, or there's often accompanying illustration where it says company hierarchy, and it's this roughly drawn pyramid, and at the top it has sociopaths, in the middle it has clueless, and the bottom it has losers. And it sounds, it's very Gervais, it's very Office, but I think there's truth in it. Not that everybody leading is a sociopath, obviously. There are sociopaths that are in high positions. Not that everybody in the middle is clueless, and certainly not that everybody in the bottom is losers. I mean, they're losers in that they're losing out on opportunity, or they're maybe not like pushing themselves into the direction they could be. But it's sort of a funny, somewhat cruel way of looking at company hierarchy. And I don't think you have to turn yourself into a sociopath to be successful. But I do think being a bit more vocal or pushing yourself into more of a leadership or entrepreneurial role, even if you're uncomfortable doing it, will, help you level up your career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. And something too that I think is worth calling out here too is this idea of leadership, but there's also the opposite. There's the yin to leadership's yang, which is followership. And I think this is a really interesting topic. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. The first time I heard that term, I actually kind of giggled and thought it was a fake term making fun of leadership, but it's not. And I actually interviewed Dr. David Leitner last year sometime. He's written lots of stuff about followership and he's done a lot of studies and stuff. And the idea is that you sort of take a lot of those, what we might call leadership behaviors. And I think this is also very much in line with a lot of the entrepreneurial kind of concepts, but it's, being like owning the problem. Not waiting until you're just told exactly what to do, going off and finding solutions on your own, taking the initiative and things like that to ultimately help improve the larger organization, the larger business that you work for, the team that you work for, the concept. It could even be something that's like beyond an org, like democracy or freedom of speech or whatever it is, and not waiting around for someone to tell you what to do. And I think for me, that's sort of the key here is the initiative, the grit, like we talked about, the scrappiness. But that idea, I think that applies to that idea of followership really well. And I feel like there's a tie-in. I don't know if you've ever heard that term before.
Yeah, I've heard, and maybe it's a similar term or there's some parallels, but there's this idea of servant leadership too,
Yeah, for sure.
which is very much like we had a guest on the show and I've had him in our class a few times, Jason Maiden, who's a really well-known footwear designer, worked at Nike for a long time, started his own footwear company. And he talks a lot about servant leadership and kind of like leading from the back of the pack, like the lead lion in a pack of lions will often be at the very back, protecting his pack of lions or herd. Or what do you call a pack of lions? I don't know. Pride, I guess.
Pride. Yeah, it's pride.
So yeah, the idea that as a leader, you're not there to just boss people around, but you're there to clear obstacles for them, help them up-level their career, maybe at some point help them come higher up the company hierarchy than you are, or so I think that you say followership, servant leadership is maybe some parallels, but I do think that's an important way to frame those types of roles.
Yeah, I love that. All right, so we talked a lot about people working in ICs and stuff, but you obviously, as an instructor, as a teacher, you work a lot with students, and I think there's also this opportunity to talk about this entrepreneurial mindset as it relates to people who are learning something. And I have a lot of listeners that might be career shifters getting into design from another field, or maybe they're in a boot camp, or maybe they're in a 4-year program and they're just starting out. I'm curious, any lessons that you have for those students who can take some of those concepts and apply them to, while they're in school, obviously going out and not waiting for someone to like hand you a book to read, but going out and find yourself. But things that you've kind of observed, the most successful students, what types of traits do they generally have?
Totally. On the theme of scrappiness and sort of leveraging the resources that you have as a student, I would say one thing that successful students do is they take advantage of the faculty. And that means like office hours or, other opportunities to connect. I mean, for me, the best part of being a teacher is just getting to know the students more one-on-one and helping them, not just with school, but with their careers and things like that. And oftentimes this is years down the road, we'll reconnect and help each other out. And I think, places like Stanford, but obviously many, many institutions have just amazing people working there. You could go talk, not just within the design faculty, but you could go talk to people who've won Nobel Prizes in other, fields. You could talk to people that you just don't really have access to outside a university. So I think taking advantage of that is a big one. And the other one is just your peers and just getting to know your peers and because inevitably some of them are going to go off and start companies where you might be hired or you might find a co-founder or getting to know the folks, working with different kinds of people, getting to know what it's like to work in a team. Where are you? What are your skills and what are your weaknesses? So those kinds of things, I think that's where I see students being successful, or if they're not doing that, where they might struggle a bit.
It's sad to say, I went to college and I took a very long time to graduate. I think 7-8 years and before I finally dropped out and then finally went back later. I've spent a long time, a lot of my adult life in college. And I am sad to say that I have never been to a single office hours unless I was prompted to do it by a teacher who told me, come see me during my office hours. I don't think I ever actually took advantage of an office hour. And just like you said, there are people at school, at your university, and they have office hours and you could drop in, anybody could drop in right? I mean, what professor is going to turn away a student who even isn't even in their class? Like, you don't have to be in their class to go and meet with them. You could talk to them, pick their brain. They are there to talk to the student. They set time aside for that. And one of my biggest regrets, all the years that I spent in college, was not taking advantage of that, And like you said, if you're at a big university, especially, and you've got prominent faculty that may have written books, whatever, prominent, well-known in the industry, whatever industry they're in, and you can figure out what their office hours are, take advantage of that. You've paid thousands upon thousands of dollars to go to that school. Take advantage of it.
I did not do office hours as a student. I don't know if I was just too shy, or I certainly didn't take my own advice that I give now. But I do, like, in retrospect, I wish I had. And I did develop like a pretty close relationship with at least a few folks on my faculty and took some advanced classes. One in particular, which stood out, was one of the longest running design professors at Stanford. His name is Matt Kahn. He kind of came out of the whole Bauhaus school of design and had these very, like, I almost said rigid, but it was more like a very specific framework for teaching design. He was also, I would say, almost his probably most preeminent skill was as a critic. He was a fantastic critic of design. It could also be very, like, sharp and kind of scathing at times. Not so much, not of the person, although sometimes it felt personal, but of the work. And so he really did it in a way that made you strive for, like, this time I'm going to get something that he really, really likes. And eventually I figured it out, and I did a few projects that he really liked. And it just felt so much better knowing that if this was bullshit, he would call it out. And he really kind of recognized hard work and good work. But anyway, over time, some of his classes were actually at his a campus, and a small group of us would go and hang out and have a glass of wine and talk about design stuff. So those types of things, I think, yeah, they're hard to replicate outside the university. So if you can take advantage of them while you're there, it's great.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is just something I wish to God I had done, and who knows where I'd be today. I mean, just the random conversations that you could have. You never know where those conversations will spark, the opportunities they might lead to. God, you just take advantage of it. You're already paying insane amount of money to go to college these days. That is one huge thing that just people seem to ignore. All right. So Eli, we've had you for a little while now. Before we get out of here, any closing thoughts? Anything else you think you want to touch on that we have not hit on as it relates to taking that entrepreneurial mindset and applying it to your career outside of running your own business?
Well, yeah, I think it could feel like a big leap to say, okay, I have a full-time job and I want to go be an entrepreneur, and I'm going to, like, leave all that, like, leave behind the paycheck and leave behind that security. And I think one thing maybe we touched on a little bit, but I didn't really go deep into, is that a lot of my kind of career was spent, I had a full-time job, but I would experiment or prototype other things. So while I was working full-time, I was interested in photography. So what does that look like? And how do I try that out? Or I was, interested in, other types of design other than product design. How could I try that? How could I get a client with this other type of design? Being experimental, even while you're with a full-time job, you're like, what would that career look like? What would teaching look like in my case? Go try that. And I tried, I was the first to coach for the class where I became a lecturer. And what are the lightweight ways you can try things? So I think, not being daunted by having to, like, burn the boats and go full-time into entrepreneurship, but just prototyping, trying things out.
I love that. I was talking to somebody recently and they used this term, and I found this brilliant. I've been, like, screaming about this ever since. But when you look at sort of the quote unquote successful entrepreneur and you see them on LinkedIn or you see them on YouTube or whatever, a lot of them, right, started out doing whatever they're doing while they were working for someone else. But they would never tell you that. They wouldn't put it on their LinkedIn profile, right? They're not gonna broadcast it like, I'm building this thing and I have a full-time job. But a lot of them, what this person was telling me, a lot of them will consider that quote unquote outside funding, which I love that idea. Yeah. It's like, you could work for somebody full-time, don't break any contracts or whatever, work within your contract, whatever. But that idea, like, working for somebody full-time, getting the paycheck while you're also doing this thing on the side. Obviously, there's, concerns with work-life balance and mental health and things like that. But if you can figure out how to work that, there is absolutely nothing wrong with having a job. And I think a lot of times this is the problem, that people will think of that as a failure. I'm a failure. Oh, I'm a failure. I mean, you mentioned, like, waiting tables and doing all these other things, working in kitchens. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to other people who, while they're trying to find a job or start a business or whatever, they're putting money on credit cards or buying things on credit cards, taking out loans, because they don't want to get a job waiting tables or working at the gas. It blows my mind how, like, laser focused people are. And this is like, I'm going to be a failure if I do this, while they take on all this debt. It's insane. I love that you're calling this out as, don't be afraid to do that. And then, also too, I think it's just, there's nothing wrong at all with not being an entrepreneur. I think you can take the mindset of an entrepreneur and apply that to be successful as an individual contributor in a larger company and never work for yourself, but still apply those things. And sometimes people, and the other thing too, we didn't talk about this, but there's sort of, your career can fluctuate. And we talked about this a little bit when we talked a few months back, but there's a playground. You could do entrepreneurship for a little while, then get a job, then go back and forth and get a job and go back. You don't have to be an entrepreneur for the rest of your life. You don't have to be working the 9 to 5 for the rest of your life. Play around with it, see what you like and then go from there. And I love that. I love that mindset. And I think we didn't talk about this either, but applying that as a student and figuring that out long before you get a job and you have a family and kids and mortgages and everything else.
That's key. Ideally, you're doing a lot of this stuff before you have kids because it gets a lot more complicated.
Oh, dude. Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. God, I know. How many, you have, two kids?
Two kids, yeah.
Two kids, yeah. I got 2 kids as well. And the amount of stuff that you have to juggle. Well, I was talking to somebody earlier today. Yeah, my wife she's got a meeting today out offsite with a thing and they're having like a bunch of people and they have a dinner and all that. So she's going to be out until like 9 or 10 o'clock. I got to get my kids for like a doctor appointment at 3 today and then go to karate and do all this stuff. It's like, plus trying to run a business and all this. So yeah, it's a freaking mess. But all right, Eli. So I've got 5 questions that I like to ask all my guests to help our listeners get to know our guests a little bit better. You have some time to stick around and answer some silly questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. First thing that comes to your mind, you don't have to think too hard about it. What is your favorite non-design book?
I'll constrain it to the category of science fiction because I have favorite books in all different types of genres. But as far as sci-fi goes, and it feels particularly relevant right now as we enter this era of AI advances, is a book called Hyperion by Dan Simmons. And it's sort of a far future sci-fi, but as you get into the book, you realize it's exploring highly advanced AI and what that might look like. And it turns out in this book that there's sort of 3 warring factions of AI. There's one that's sort of a pro-human AI. There's one that's an anti-human AI, and there's a more neutral one that doesn't seem to care either way. And it's quite fascinating, and it's an interesting thought experiment in how things might turn out once we develop generative AI, because it's not going to be one generative AI. It'll likely be multiple, or sorry, not general, not generative, AGI. And yeah, that's a worthwhile read right now just to go through that thought experiment.
That isn't, I never considered that actually until just now, but I mean, it makes sense, right? If you're building general intelligence and that computer can now think for itself, multiple computer systems will come to multiple conclusions because humans are, we all think differently. We're not a monolith. AI won't also be a monolith. And so there may be some that want to kill all the humans and there might be some that want to help the humans beat the other ones because they realize the other one's dangerous and they're fighting and they're making allies. And don't spoil it, but did it come to a conclusion at the end?
Yeah, frustratingly, I won't give spoilers, but I will say that it's a multi-book series and they're all pretty worthwhile. Okay. The first one is, I think, the best, and it goes through, I think it's like a trilogy maybe. But yeah, so I won't give it away. But if you're into sci-fi and you're into that kind of interesting and thought experiment, worth checking out.
Right on. All right, cool. I have to check that out. That's fascinating. I love that. I never considered that until just now. I don't know why I never thought of that, but I don't spend a lot of time thinking about general AI. I guess that's why. All right. What is your favorite non-design podcast?
Yeah, so I don't actually listen to a lot of design podcasts occasionally, but it sort of feels like work if I'm doing that. And sometimes that's worthwhile doing that. But I listen to mostly like humor podcasts, actually, aside from the design stuff. So a lot of Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend I've been listening to.
Oh, I love it. Oh, it's so funny.
He has great guests, and those are fun. But I actually think the funnier ones are when he just has random people. Conan O'Brien Needs a Fan, I think he calls those, because he'll get just random people from around the world that have kind of funny life situations, and they have a lot of fun together. So yeah, that's definitely a current favorite.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, that's a good one. I always liked those when Norm Macdonald was on too. I love Norm Macdonald.
He's
one of my favorites. But may he rest in peace.
Yes.
All right. What is your favorite meal? This could be something you cook, your grandma used to cook, restaurant, favorite meal.
I really love to cook, actually, and it's sort of because I don't do physical product design anymore. It's sort of an outlet for me to be creative in the physical realm. And there is a recipe that my mom, she didn't create it, but she's sort of adapted it. It's bouillabaisse, which is a sort of French fish stew. And I catch a lot of my own fish here in Monterey, so I'll make that recipe. My wife really likes it. Unfortunately, kids aren't big fish eaters. My son kind of, but yeah, so it's mostly a meal for the grown-ups, but that's one of my favorites.
I love it. Yeah, if you're not making it out of chicken nuggets, they're not eating it. That's been my experience with my kids.
That's right.
That sounds good. Oh man, fresh fish. That's got to be. What kind of fish do you catch?
Around here, rockfish is a lot of what we catch. People call it rock cod. Also, it's not really a cod, or a ling cod, also not a cod, but those are some of the common ones in our area.
Right on. Do you do like fishing out on a boat? Do you have pier? Do you do how do you fish?
I do spear fishing. And it's funny.
You're diving.
Diving, yes. It's funny. For a long time, I was sort of hesitant to talk about it because I came out of this underwater photographer kind of world where it's sort of understandably frowned upon to be a spearfisher because you're in some areas that are more sensitive. You're taking out like some of the apex predators or bigger species. But I learned it from a friend of mine who works at Fish and Game, so I know how to do it sustainably. And it's actually probably the most sustainable form of fishing if you do it right because you can identify the fish. There's no bycatch. There's no fishing lines getting tangled, that kind of stuff. So it's a very sustainable way to fish. And yeah, so that's what I do around here.
I never thought about that. But yeah, when you're fishing, you have no idea what you're going to reel up, right? So yeah, that's cool. That's fascinating. You get a meal and you get to hang out for a few hours and then you get to eat afterwards. No, you don't have to go to the grocery store. I love it. All right. What is your favorite vacation spot?
I would say there's, again, like restricting it to a certain area in the world because I have different favorite spots in different areas in the world. But if we're talking about Europe, I've been to Biarritz a number of times and it's in the south of France. It's sort of on the border of France and Spain. And it's just this beautiful spot. It's a surf spot. I'm a surfer, so that's great. It's also got great food because it's sort of this blend of French and Catalan influences. And then the last time we were there, we stayed right next to this beautiful market hall. And so we were able to get fresh seafood and produce and stuff right there and cook. And then it's also, I think, become something of like maybe a celebrity magnet because last time we were there, this was a couple years ago, we ended up sitting next to James Hetfield for dinner. Like he was across from us from Metallica.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And then the next day I went to rent a surfboard and this guy walked up. It's like, oh man, he looks really familiar. And it was the guy that plays Felix Leiter in the more recent James Bond, or he was also in that series Westworld. Forgetting his name, but he's a pretty well-known actor.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, you live in a place where basically a lot of people would go for vacation.
That's true.
So I'm thinking, you're like up in the mountains in the snow. Do you like to go skiing for your vacation or something? But yeah. No, I love that. All right, dude. Last question. What is your favorite design tool that is not Figma?
So one tool that I've been using a lot is called Capsule. It's more of like a motion graphics video tool, but it's really handy for making. So I do some little like audio trailers that has some animation in them. And it also has sort of like generative AI elements to it, which I don't use as much. Sometimes I use the music function, but it's just a really great, quick tool. It has sort of editing capability, like transcript editing capabilities like a Descript might, but it's a bit more visual. So it's not exactly a design tool, but kind of for creating motion graphics assets, it's really fun, powerful.
I'll allow it. Yeah, anything goes. It's my show. Do what I want. I will allow that as an answer. All right, Eli. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I had a blast talking to you. I learned quite a bit. And I think everybody listening out there is going to learn quite a bit too. Just taking that entrepreneurial mindset, thinking about how you can apply it to your career. And especially for students, I think that's so important too. I think just at the end of the day, like no one's going to give you something for free. Right? You got to like go out there. You got to get it yourself. You got to take the initiative because no one's going to do anything for you. And I think that's an important lesson. Hopefully we learn that sooner rather than later. And I think people are going to get a lot out of this episode. Before we close it out, Eli, let everybody know where they can find you. Give all the stuff you got going on a plug and let everybody know where they can find you.
Best place is just go to designbetter.com and you can find our show, the books that I'd mentioned earlier. We also have documentaries like Design Disruptors we're starting to put up there. So great resource, whether you're just getting into design or you're further along in your career. We have an archive of over 150 shows, I think, at this point. And yeah, just a lot of, and we also have it organized by topic. So if you're interested in certain topics, you can find those. So that's the thing. And then if you ever want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I pretty much accept anybody has a design background as a connection on LinkedIn. Please don't try to sell me WordPress related things. So that's the only thing that I get sort of annoyed at.
Wow. Yeah, WordPress designers, yes. website designers.
I've become cautious about anybody who has that in their title. But anyway, so yeah, if you're a designer, reach out, connect with me, you can DM me, and I'd love to say hi.
Yeah, I'm excited about those InVision books. Since the list apart went away, like InVision had very similar kind of topics, just like about design systems and design, things like that. So I'm excited to have that catalog back. It was all ebooks, if I'm not mistaken, before.
That's right. We did some print stuff. We didn't really sell them. We printed some small batches. Maybe we'll do that again at some point.
Yeah, cool. Awesome, Eli. Well, I am so excited to have you on. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much again. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me on.
Well, all right, y'all, that's it for Eli and me for today. I hope we helped to shed a little bit of light on this idea of entrepreneurial mindset and how you can apply this to your career, to school, to life in general. I think it's such an important thing. But I'm curious, have you experienced this? Have you ever taken that entrepreneurial mindset and applied it? And how did it work out for you? I'd love to know what you think. Let me know what you think on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would love it if you left a 5-star review. That would help me out so much more than you know. And if you know somebody who might find any of this stuff useful, then for the love of God, tell them about it. That would be fantastic. Don't forget to check out the Beyond UX Design shop. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/shop to pick up some big, beautiful UX-themed art prints and digital downloads you can print yourself. Grab your paperback copy of Beyond UX Design, master your craft beyond pixels and prototypes, get free shipping on all orders over $30, and use the code LISTENER to get 10% off your entire order. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/shop to get your print on. Help keep the show independent and ad-free. Check out beyonduxdesign.com/support to find out how. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, and many others, and help keep the show independent and ad-free. You'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. Get instant access to the video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. And in just 6 weeks, Femke's Product Strategy for Designers course will help you enhance your strategic influence and tackle product challenges with confidence. Join over 400 designers who have already transformed their careers with expert videos, live calls, and interactive projects. Cohort 6 starts on March 3rd, 2025, and seats are limited. Don't wait. Visit beyonduxdesign.com/strategy to enroll today. Remember to sign up for the newsletter and check out all the past episodes along with all the show notes at beyonduxdesign.com. I hope you keep coming back for more great UX tips from Beyond UX Design. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX in design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all. All right, that's it. We're done.
Cool.
Well, it's very anticlimactic. I don't know how it is with your guys. You're just like, all right, we're this it. See you later.